All right, this is the Mayor of the Airwaves. How are you, ladies and gentlemen? We continue our conversation with Karen Wilson. How do you pronounce your last name?
Buterbaugh.
Buterbaugh.
Yeah, it's German.
Buterbaugh. And she has written the book, The Baby Scoop Era, Unwed Mothers, Infant Adoption, Forced Surrender. Again, concisely, what is the Baby Scoop Era?
It's a period of time that's been defined as just after the end of World War II, or the mid-1940s, up until Roe v. Wade, which was, I think, February of 1973.
Okay.
It's a time that just was a real phenomena in that there were more babies surrendered to adoption than at any other time of our history before or since.
Yeah, and you were a natural exiled mother, and you believe that you were forced to give your child up for adoption. You would later be reconciled 30 years later. Now,
Yes.
During those 30 years when you didn't know where your daughter was or if she was still alive, what her name might be, was there a pain in your heart? Was there a ghost following you about? How did that feel?
Oh, it was terrible. I mean, I was very, I would cry a lot. I had to kind of hide the grief that I felt because I was not allowed to talk about it. We were told never to tell anybody where we had been or what had happened. I had actually had pictures of my newborn, which was rather miraculous because we were not allowed to have cameras in the maternity home I was in Washington, D.C., the Florence Crittenden. We were not allowed to have cameras. We were not allowed to have anything.
Really?
Oh, really? No, they didn't want us to have evidence of anything to do with our experience. We could write letters in and out, but they were read, and they were censored. Same with incoming mail, and it was only, from people who were on an approved list. It was a very punitive experience. We never were taught about, pregnancy.
Did you feel like you had a red letter on your back?
Yes, absolutely, I did.
In society, I
felt shamed. I felt guilt for what I was putting my parents through. It was a horrible, traumatic experience.
Okay.
I mean, to this day, when I hear certain songs from that time, send me right back into it.
Name me one or two of those songs.
Oh, it's Simon and Garfunkel. Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Homeward Bound is a maternity home anthem. Like a Rock. Sounds of Silence.
Okay, listen. Now, when you reconcile, now James, you're there. Are you there, James?
Yes, sir, I am here.
Okay, now James is on the other side. He was given up at birth by my friend Linda, and Linda had a relationship with my brother. I never knew that James existed. 46 years he's been alive, and I never knew he existed. And he found us last year, almost a year ago, and his half-sister, my brother, also had a child that was put up for adoption by another young lady. And, of course, James was born. You were born in 1969, the year of Woodstock, right?
No, I was July 1st, 1970.
Okay, so you were conceived. Yeah, could you come a little closer so we can hear you better, James?
Yes, I'm trying.
Okay. Anyway, so on the other side of this, all these years, when you were very close to the father, the man who adopted you, and the woman who adopted you, but you were wounded deeply when your father died when you were, 13, 14?
I was wounded deeply a number of times, I suppose. The first wound happened when I was separated from my natural mother. That's a wound that, is just on a subconscious primal level.
Yeah.
And then, you go through life and you survive and you fall deeply in love with your adopted parents, hopefully, that you've wound up in a good adopted family. That's a little bit of a crapshoot, and I got lucky.
Did you not pursue your biological parents or mother or whatever, my brother, your father, because you didn't want to hurt their feelings when they were alive?
There was a lot of reasons. One was the lack of information. I had none. I had nothing to go on. DNA testing didn't exist back then. So with no information, nothing to go on. And, I'm not faulting my adopted mom, but, unfortunately at least I was told I was adopted, but unfortunately the words bloodline and adoption were forbade in my household and with our extended family. It's just not a conversation that we ever had.
Now, Matthew has said, how Jimmy, your son, and my brother's grandson, is more reticent, diffident, quiet compared to Luke. Now, I found out to my surprise that the doctor in the family, Dr. Matthew, he told me when he was visiting us down here that he said, James used to be more like Jimmy, and that this whole process has brought you, has changed you entirely. I mean, you're far more outgoing. Do you recognize what Dr. Matthew said that's valid?
Without a doubt. I mean, I've struggled my entire life with self-confidence issues, and I've gotten to the point as the years have progressed where I was able to successfully become self-confident. And reuniting with my family, with my natural family, has just been a tremendous boost to that progression of confidence. When I was a child, if I walked in with my parents into a room full of strangers, I would often just go into the corner of the room and just stand there, not wanting to look or talk to anyone.
Yeah.
So in essence, James, you felt invisible,
I don't know, anything that I felt as growing up as an adoptee, I kind of locked away and hid it deep down. I didn't really process it.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can hide. And the worst thing is, they say, let's say I have a character flaw, and somebody makes me aware of it. Well, I believe you're 60% home to getting rid of it if you have the desire, if you're aware of it. But if I cover up my eye with my one hand, my right eye now, and you say, Rhett, you're blind, and I go, no, I'm not. I'm not blinded. I can see you clearly. Things can be so deep that the pain of it. I remember, this sounds silly to maybe some people listening, but I remember one time my brother, your father, and I came down for spring break to Florida from upstate New York, and my brother was living on his boat with his wife, Celia, his one and only wife of his lifetime, and they were living on this watercraft together, the sailboat. And I remember we were on the street, and we're walking along, and he just said, come on, dum-dum. Now, my brother, you got to understand my brother. My brother always treated me so sweet when he was 4.5 years older than me. When he went out with other boys, when I was like 8 and he was 12 or 13, he'd bring home like a rubber knife, or he'd bring home a little gift or something. He was always thoughtful. So he never put me down. He never hurt me my whole life. I don't think we ever physically had a battle or anything. And so for him to call, it was kind of like an affectionate dum-dum. But to me, I remember now here I'm about 21 years age, however old I was, and I remember, ooh, that hurt, but I didn't even admit to myself it hurt. It hurt, and that's all I knew, and I went on. Then, years later, I'm realizing, ow, when you get honest with yourself, that hurt. And when I called someone else dum-dum, and I said, oh, so now I was hurt, so now I'm giving it to somebody else. And that, anyway, so I can, anyway, I don't know. Do you see how that all connects to this? I hope you do. I just wanted to share that.
Yes. I want to mention that, while we have Karen involved with our conversation here.
Yeah.
An important historical event is how the Florence, I'll let Karen speak to this, but how the homes changed from supporting mothers and encouraging them to keep their children and helping them get careers and an income. Yeah. How they changed and evolved into what became the baby scoop era. Karen, could you speak on that subject, please?
Yes, I'd love to, because it absolutely blew my mind when I found out. I started researching the Florence Crittendens because I said, I had to have the information about everything to do with my experience. So I started researching the Florence Crittendens and found out that prior to the baby scoop era, the Florence Crittendens were run on the tenet of keeping mother and child together. I had never known that. Now, that's because of Kate Waller Barrett, who's a very famous Virginian, and one of the first women physicians in the country who worked with Charles Crittenden, who had a lot of money, and they created the Florence Crittenden maternity homes all over the country. Well, they had these Christian women there that would help the mothers keep their babies. They had child care for their babies when the mothers would leave the home and go to work. And they would actually place the mothers into jobs that they could work and get paid so that they had their babies kept with them. And they would visit them. They had sisters, they called them sisters, who would go and visit the new mothers and give them money and clothing and food for the baby.
Mm-hmm.
And this went on until the mid-40s, and this is because of the advent of social work as a profession. And I found this out through a book by Regina Kunzel called Fallen Women, Problem Girls, and it outlines the whole evolution of how the Florence Crittendens and the Salvation Army homes that were run the same way of keeping mother and child together, and they even had the original foster homes for mother and child together, how that all evolved over time through the late 40s because the social workers started putting out to the media that they were the experts in unwed motherhood. So they created a specialty within their newly formed or fledgling profession of social work, and they created a specialized child welfare. Just like doctors, they have primary care and they have, cardiologists. So they had the specialized segment of social work, and it had pertained to infant adoption. Well, those social workers began to convince the public that they knew how to cure this huge problem of unwed motherhood, and it wasn't really huge except that the population explosion occurred at this time because if war ended and you had the baby boom, and so therefore you had a lot more teenagers in the world or in the country, and they said it was an epidemic because there were so many more unwed mothers. So they started convincing the public that they were needed in these homes, and so they started insinuating themselves into these maternity homes and changed the way they were constructed from keeping the mother and child together to curing the mother of her problem, which was her newborn, because they did not want us to take the baby back to our houses and raise them ourselves because they had a ready market. So this is a whole evolution of how things changed from the mid-40s into the 50s, and it happened kind of slowly, and then it started to speed up to the point where every maternity home had social workers. Now, many of these social workers, and it says in my book, were not fully trained. And honestly, I don't know how you could properly train anybody to remove a baby and put it in the arms of somebody else. And that's a godlike thing that should never be done unless it's extreme circumstances or proven, neglect or abuse. But we mothers were never even tried.
Yeah.
It was just mandated. So this was a real eye-opening learning process for me to find out that, oh my God, the home I was in Washington D.C. it was created by Kate Waller Barrett. She made sure all of the homes were run by these Christian women, and this happened because she actually took in an unwed mother who came to her door one night, and it was raining outside, and the woman knocked at her door, and Kate Waller Barrett was married to a pastor, and so she let the woman in, and she said, it just struck me that here are these two babies lying side by side. My baby's going to have every chance in life, and her baby is not. And how unfair that is. not only to the mother, but to the baby, most especially. So that led her to do this mission of, helping mothers keep their babies and making sure that, they stayed together. She said that no man should put that relationship asunder, just like the marriage vows, It's a relationship that should be everlasting and forever, and it's sacred. So it was quite an eye-opener for me.
You both have interesting stories because you're on different sides.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's amazing to me how our injuries are so similar.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the loss, it's the anger, it's the grief, it's so many things mirror each other.
Nope.
Well, there was a lot of hurt on both sides.
A lot of hurt, and it can you can find healing if you're willing to face it and deal with it and not hide it and sweep it under a rug. You can find healing, but it's something that can never be cured. It just, it's a relationship that never should have been tampered with.
I can't hear you.
And it's very, very tragic that it happened to begin with. And we need our population, our society, our culture to understand that this is something that should not continue to happen. I mean, in essence, you could look at this as, child trafficking. I mean, it's the transfer of a human being, and this poor baby is totally defenseless and has no say over its own life and how it's raised or where it ends up, and it can be a very abusive situation given the wrong circumstances, and that just should never happen. Babies should stay with their mothers. The mothers should be supported fully.
Yes.
If she can't or absolutely won't, then you should look to her family to raise that child, which is called kinship care. If that can't happen, then you go to legal guardianship instead of adoption, because this kinship care would legally protect the child's original name and all of its family information and forever access to family members. So there are no secrets, no lies, nothing's covered up, nothing's locked away. The child's needs are fully protected, and adoption doesn't do that.
Huge
it
point.
doesn't happen in open adoption.
Okay,
and
James.
It certainly didn't happen during closed adoption.
James, you said huge point?
Huge, enormous point of, how adoption is so very much flawed and what it needs to change into. Profit needs to be taken away, and everything Karen just said was spot on just now.
All right, so we're coming up. We got about 6 more minutes of this broadcast. I want to make sure that you guys use this for the people that are listening. Listening, folks, adoption. Have you been adopted? You know somebody that's adopted? You know somebody that would like this show? Make sure they tune in. Don't forget our show on adoption will run again tomorrow from 6 a.m. until 8 a.m. Now, the book by Karen Wilson-Buterbaugh is The Baby Scoop Era, subtitle, Unwed Mothers, Infant Adoption, Forced Surrender. It's available on Amazon.com, The Baby Scoop. What are people going to get from your book? What is it all about?
Well, they're going to get a very good overview of what happened, who was responsible, why they did what they did, what the consequences of it have been, where to point the finger. Don't blame the mothers. We were totally defenseless as well. Mm-hmm. The ones responsible for this are the people who practiced adoption, infant adoption, the adoption workers, the adoption lawyers, the maternity homes. The whole industry is responsible for this, and it needs to end. People are being severely injured, as James said. This is a pre-verbal injury for the baby, and that scars the brain, and it scars the brain in ways that affect them the rest of their lives, and that is abusive. And so I see infant adoption as extremely abusive, not only to the mother but also to her child.
So you're anti-adoption?
I am anti-adoption, absolutely. I am natural family preservation. And if you're natural family preservation, you support humane alternatives.
Well, you can
and
take
the alternatives are take adoption workers out of their pregnancy.
Yeah. Another thing,
doctors out of her pregnancy.
but also
and let her go through the whole 6-week postpartum period. And if she wants to surrender her baby, then so be it.
Okay. Now another thing else too. We should go back to the Waltons. Remember the TV show The Waltons? Was it the Waldens or the Waltons? Waldens, right? Mm-hmm. Like in Walton's Pond? Okay. Because really, in a perfect environment, throughout the world, grandparents, ostensibly, like in China and Japan, raise the grandchildren while the parents are actively working in the workforce. Yeah. And really, it makes for a much better rounded family for children to have the grandparents living in the same home. And really, families, just like right now, my first instinct with James and Cece is if I was loaded in dough like the Kennedys, I'd have like the Kennedy compound. We'd have a compound, and we could all be together because that connection is very valuable to all of us, right, James?
Yes, and one other thing to interject here really quickly is oftentimes when an adoptee speaks to the point where we're considered anti-adoption because we know it needs to be reformed immensely.
Yes.
Everyone's, you must have I'm sorry, you must have had a bad adoption experience. Well, no, many of us didn't. I didn't. I had a wonderful adoption experience. It doesn't change anything.
Yeah. All right, listen, so we're about out of time. I want to thank James Alfano, my nephew, for putting this show together today.
Yes.
Appreciate it. I don't know how did, and now Karen Wilson-Buterbaugh has the book, The Baby Scoop Era, Unwed Mothers, Infant Adoption, Forced Surrender. Now, how did you two connect? You got 30 seconds before the computer shuts us off.
Probably through all of our adoption groups that we're members of. I know that I've seen James posting, and I'm sure he's seen me posting, and so that's how we met up.
Oh, you haven't met physically yet?
No, not physically yet. But I want to thank you and James hugely for giving me a voice because mothers have not had a voice, and it's what's desperately needed.
Well, thank you for coming on our show today, folks.